We would like to welcome to Beyond 3D a great DJ coming to us live from London, England, named Mark Devlin. And Mark, it's a pleasure to have you on the show with us this evening.
Matt, it's good to be on. Happy to be here.
Well, that's fantastic. Now, you are into the music scene. You're a DJ. And just, if you can, give a brief description of what you do to our listeners so that way they know where we're going to go with this conversation.
Yeah, well, I've been a radio and club DJ for the past 26 years. And during that time, I've done various radio shows on different stations. I've done gigs. I've been fortunate enough to do gigs all around the world. I've been to Australia 6 times, played a whole bunch of gigs out there. Never been to Perth. I never actually made it, but I've done Sydney and Melbourne and Gold Coast and Brisbane, places like that. And, many other countries, so I had a pretty good innings. I still do DJ, but to a much lesser degree than I used to, because my life has changed a lot in the last 5 years, and I'm doing a whole load of stuff now which I never imagined I would be. And if you told me 10 years ago that right now I would be doing public talks and radio shows and podcasts and putting out books on the sort of subject area that I am, I would never have believed you. I'd have thought you were on drugs or something. But here I am doing it. And, I've been following a very different path since 2010, which is the year where I underwent what I refer to as a conscious awakening. And that was me coming to an understanding of the fact that this world is actually nothing like what we've spent our entire lives being programmed and conditioned to believe that it is. And there's some very different stuff going on beneath the glossy surface when you really get down to it. And if you're someone that is vigilant and committed enough to do the research, then you can get to the bottom of what's really going on, who's really controlling things, what the agenda is, and what things like the entertainment industry are really being used for. I've got this quote on the back cover of the book, which starts off saying, "To most people, the music industry represents a fun and harmless method of entertainment. But when you get beneath the surface, you discover, there's some very nefarious, malevolent things going on." I'm paraphrasing, but that's on the back cover of the book. And that pretty much sums up what I'm now into and the type of information that I'm now putting across. So it is a bit different.
I'll tell you what, it's a subject that's near and dear to our hearts. I'll give you a little brief background of myself. I'm a musician as well. And my grandfather was in Cab Calloway and Duke Ellington's bands back in the 30s and the 40s.
Wow.
And a lot of these guys were Freemasons. And so there was a lot going on with them as well. I think it was more a gentleman's club back then. There were many different levels of the Masonic orders. But music in general, going back even to those times, was very well controlled by certain entities. And when I went over your book, you cover the music that you love, because I believe you, as a DJ, you did love rap music, and I know you've heard that you were totally into rap music and that whole scene. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm mainly known, or have been known, as a hip-hop DJ, or hip-hop and R&B, black music generally. So I've got into soul, funk, reggae, dancehall, soulful house, garage, all those different spin-offs. But first and foremost, I've been a hip-hop DJ. That's the stuff that I've played on the radio. That's what I'm known for playing in the clubs. And I don't like to refer to myself as that anymore, because when you mention hip-hop to the current generation of young music fans, their mind goes straight to the likes of Lil Wayne and Nicki Minaj and Drake and Rick Ross and Big Sean and Kanye West and all this stuff that is masquerading under the label of hip-hop. And in actual fact, it bears no resemblance whatsoever to the original true art form of hip-hop and the heritage of it and what went before. It's been bastardized and corrupted and distorted and watered down beyond belief to something that just is not hip-hop. Whatever else it is, it's not hip-hop. So all these terms have lost their meaning. What passes as R&B these days, I think there's a lot of young people that think R&B stands for Rihanna and Beyonce, and they don't even realise that it refers to rhythm and blues. And, people that were around in the time of Marvin Gaye and Sam Cooke and Aretha Franklin and all these artists would be absolutely horrified at the sort of stuff that is being pushed out under the banner of R&B, so-called, these days. So everything has been completely co-opted and changed by the corporate forces that control the industry over the last few years. And it's interesting what you were saying about going back to the era of Cab Calloway, and there was evidence of the industry being controlled even then, and Freemasonic influences and stuff. I've got a very good friend of mine is an author by the name of John Hamer, and he provided a quote for the back of the book. And he's written various books, including The Falsification of History, and he's written books about Jack the Ripper and Titanic, and got down to the true story of what really happened in both of those cases, which is very different from the version that we learn in schools and that we get from the mainstream media. So, all this twisting of truth has been going on forever. And he made the point that you can take it back to the days of Mozart and Beethoven and guys like that. And even back then, there was an industry for this classical music that was picking its favourites, its chosen ones, and elevating them to the top of the tree. So they were the ones whose music got pushed out to the masses, and they became the household names of the time. But all along, there were a whole bunch of other musicians that were putting out wonderful compositions that were every bit as powerful and impactful as Beethoven and Mozart, but you never got to hear about, because these were the ones that they wanted to push, and there was probably some kind of agenda going on even then, and there would definitely have been a Freemasonic influence going on back then. So I'm absolutely blown away by how far back this whole thing goes. In my research, I've been constantly revising the timeline, because when I first started looking into all this stuff, it was videos from the likes of Jay-Z and Kanye West and Rihanna and Beyonce and Britney Spears, and I made the mistake of thinking, it's something that's been going on in the 2000s. They started this agenda in the last 15 years or whatever. And then I realised that it goes back way further. You can find examples of these methods of control going back to the 1970s, 1960s, 1950s, and I came to realise that the entire corporate music industry and the entertainment industry generally, which incorporates Hollywood movies and television, were actually set up for the purpose of mind controlling the masses and of getting certain symbolism out there and creating certain perceptions in the subliminal minds of the general public. And that was the entire reason for these institutions being set up, because these psychopathic satanic controllers that we have in all areas of human activity would not take a chance on these genres just evolving naturally. They would not be able to sit back and just watch certain artists and certain groups become popular on their own, organically, naturally. They would have to be in control of that. They could not let it take a natural course. And so that's what they've done. And right from the start, they've picked their favourites. They've picked the ones that they want to use to push certain agendas. And it really has been going on forever. And what we see today with some of these names that I mentioned, Kanye West and Jay-Z and Nicki Minaj and Lil Wayne and all these other artists, is just a modern play-out of these schemes and these tactics and these methods that they've been using for decades. The names change. So in the 60s, it was the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and these days it's, a different bunch of artists, but the agenda always remains the same. And they get generation after generation by just switching up the names and tapping into the spirit of the times and tapping into the subconscious minds of the public the whole while.
Mark, I was looking at some Jay-Z clips the other day, and he pretty much throws it out there in your face that he holds up the all-seeing eye symbol when he does that with his hand, the pyramid.
Yeah.
It's blatantly out there. And the impression I get from that whole, you mentioned it as a hip-hop scene, which it's no longer a hip-hop scene anymore. To me, it's like a hierarchy of a Sicilian Godfather type deal, where you've got the upper echelons of those people that sit at the top of the food chain, like your Jay-Z's and that, who then control the up-and-coming artists underneath, and then those guys get a slice of their pie and then control what gets put out through what they're told to do. Is this true?
It's kind of like a hierarchy, and you can see that play out in the artists that we get put out into the public eye. So Jay-Z is certainly very senior in the pecking order now. There's rumours that he is a Freemason himself. He's said to be a part of the Boule, which is this organisation specifically for black people. And it's like a Freemasonic order, a secret society, but it's reserved specifically for black people in influential areas of society. So that would be entertainment, big business, politics, and everything else, the military, science, the media, all that stuff. So Jay-Z is said to be a part of that, and he certainly brought different artists through, particularly in his role as CEO of Def Jam, the Def Jam record label, which is a role he took up in about 2005, and he's credited with bringing Rihanna through as a brand new artist, and a whole bunch of others during his tenure as head of Def Jam Records. So he certainly is senior, but you do hear a lot of people say, oh, Jay-Z is in the Illuminati. Jay-Z is one of, he's up there with the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds, and this would certainly not be the case. Even though he might be fairly senior in the pecking order, he's still a stooge. He's still a bagman for the real controllers, and he's still doing what he's told. Everything he does is under instruction and direction from those that really control him and that really control the industry. But we've certainly seen this over the years in the rap industry. So you had Eminem, for instance, was said to have been discovered by Dr. Dre, and it was Dr. Dre that put him on the map. And then Eminem and Dr. Dre together are said to have brought through 50 Cent. They're said to have discovered him and put him on the map and got him famous. And then 50 Cent had his G-Unit collective, so he brought through a bunch of other artists like Lloyd Banks and Young Buck and Tony Yayo. So you have all these different crews and these different collectives that bring through other artists, and it's like an umbrella type arrangement. But ultimately, you come to realise that they're all controlled, and nothing happens by accident, and nothing takes a natural organic path. It's all blueprints and templates that are being rolled out, and they just pick the individuals that they want to be the public face and the flagship characters of these different agendas.
I was talking to Matt on air about Kanye's song that he put out last year with the album Life of Pablo. There's a particular song that he released called True Friends, Real Friends, Matt. I can't remember what we just played earlier. It was that impressive. But all he does is just complain non-stop. Now, this is a man who went on social media a couple of years ago and put a call out to his fans because he had no jet fuel.
Okay, I'll miss that one. But
no jet fuel.
Kanye is a big disappointment to me and many other bona fide hip-hop fans, because when he first came out, and I've made this point many times in my public talks and stuff, when he first came out, he was a very promising artist. He started out as a producer, actually. He produced beats for the likes of Jay-Z and a whole load of other artists within that Rockefeller Records, Rock Nation. There's an interesting name for you, interesting choice of record label. He produced beats for a lot of artists that came out of that, and a lot of artists in Cameron's Diplomats Dipset camp, and he made a name for himself as a producer. And then in about 2003, he announced that he wanted to become an artist himself, and he revealed that he had skills as a rapper. And so he came out with his first album, The College Dropout. And for many hip-hop heads, this was a real breath of fresh air, because there were a lot of conscious tracks on there. He was talking about a lot of very meaningful stuff in the lyrics, not least in the track All Falls Down. Some great lines in that, such as, "The prettiest people do the ugliest things on the road to riches and diamond rings." He's talking about materialism and how it corrupts people's morals. And isn't that ironic, given the way his career has panned out since? But he had all these great songs. Jesus Walks. He's talking about, a man grappling with his spiritual beliefs and trying to reconcile those with the temptations of this physical world, which is a great concept to get into. So he had that on his first album, and there were some great samples on there, some great old soul and funk records being sampled. And then he came out with his second album, Late Registration, a couple of years later, and that had things like Diamonds from Sierra Leone on. He's talking about blood diamonds. So there were still a lot of conscious tracks on there. But then something happened to this dude round about 2005, and I pinpoint it to when he appeared on that US telethon in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. And he was on stage he's on camera with Mike Myers, the Austin Powers actor. And they're reading this script, and they're trying to get people to give up their money for all these charitable things that they've set up in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. And Kanye, at this key moment, goes off script, and totally spontaneously, he says George Bush doesn't care about black people, because Hurricane Katrina particularly hit the city of New Orleans really harshly. And, you know, there was a big black population down there that evidently were not getting the aid that they needed, and they just weren't being supported and weren't being given what was necessary. And a lot of people placed the blame at the door of George Bush. So Kanye came out and made this comment, and, you know, Mike Myers next to him looks really awkward, and there's probably a producer screaming in his ear saying, "What the hell are you saying? Get back on track." And it seems to me that from that point onward, Kanye's career changed. And you got to wonder whether he started to receive directions and instructions at that point in his career to start changing his music and start corrupting it and start talking about some different kind of things. Because from that point on, gone was any semblance of any meaningful, conscious music. The beats started to change. He came out about 3 years after that with his god-awful album 808s and Heartbreak, which was done entirely in auto-tune, which I absolutely despise and loathe with a vengeance. You know, it's this software plug-in which makes a human voice sound like a goddamn robot, and it's become very, very fashionable within hip-hop, and reggae dancehall now as well has picked up on auto-tune. And it's horrific, and nobody you speak to likes it, and especially musicians, but it's all over the bloody place. And Kanye came out with an entire album with this stuff, and he was one of the pioneers of this technique, if you want to call it that. And there was a lot of dark things that started happening in his life around that time. His mother, he was very close, famously, to his mother, Donda, and she died very suddenly, apparently as the result of undergoing surgery, some kind of plastic surgery. She'd gone on the surgeon's table to undergo this operation, and we're told that it went wrong and she died. And Kanye was very cut up about this, understandably, and it occurred around about the same time that he split with his longtime fiancée, a girl by the name of Alexis Pfeiffer. And so 808s and Heartbreak is said to be a kind of catharsis for him, where he's pouring out his grief about all this stuff that's happening in his life. And of course we're getting into the realms here of the suggestion of ritual sacrifice of artists and close family members in the entertainment industry. And for a lot of people, they'll instantly switch off at the suggestion that the industry sacrifices its own artists or requires its key artists to make a blood sacrifice of a loved one, somebody close to them. But, you know, for these people that their first instinct is to just walk away from it all, I would invite them to look at the large amount of evidence that there is to suggest that this sort of thing does actually go on. In my book, I've listed a whole bunch of resources from insiders, whistleblowers, various researchers that have looked into this subject area, and it ties into ritual sacrifice that goes on in other areas of human society as well. It's a very dark and ugly subject area, and it's tempting to walk away from it, but that is exactly the kind of public reaction that the dark occult practitioners that preside over these industries are relying on. That's exactly what they want. People saying, "Oh, this is too horrific for me, I don't want to look at this," or "It's too impossible, it's incredible, it can't possibly be going on, it's ridiculous, I don't need to look at this." For as long as people take those kind of attitudes, expect more of the same. It will continue. You know, this stuff needs facing up to. It needs large numbers of people to come to an understanding of what's going on, because none of it will stop until that happens. So this is what I'm trying to get across with the information in the book. And you'll find me going off at many tangents, I'm sure, during this conversation, because the subject area is so vast that I do tend to get sidetracked. I know we were talking about Kanye, but it all ties together. Ultimately, all these different subject areas are connected, and there's a massive, big jigsaw puzzle at the end of it that I would invite people to take a look at.
Well, Mark, I'll tell you something. It's interesting, when you were talking about Kanye West, the first thing that came to mind when you were talking was the fact that he had been co-opted in some way.
Yeah.
You say something about the President of the United States and what he is not doing, and they say, "We got you now. This is now what you're going to do to make amends, and if you don't do this, this is going to happen." I think this has happened to him in that instance, and I think this has happened to many people in the music industry. They get them to a certain point where they can control them, and then they can use threats. They can use all different kinds of means to get them to do their bidding and start to really program the masses. So what we're going to do, Mark, is we're going to have to hold you over for another show because we have to get into the meat and potatoes of this, the meat and all the bones of this. It's very, very important.
Mark, when we get you back next week, can we delve right into the recent news about Prince?
Sure, we can go anywhere you want to go with all this.
Sounds great, mate. Thank you very much for your time today on Beyond 3D. We really appreciate it.
No worries.
Edit point from there, and then we will continue and say, welcome to Beyond 3D, and we are pleased to have Mark Devlin, DJ and author, back with us to talk about the music industry and certain things that may be going on behind the scenes that a lot of people that listen and love music may not know about. And if they did know about it, it would change a lot of their perspective about what's going on in the world and what's going on in the industry they love so much. So, Mark, welcome back to this week's edition of Beyond 3D. We left it off last week talking about Kanye West, and as Clint said, we wanted to get into the Prince phenomenon. This is something that affected quite a number of people that I've talked to. A lot of musicians were in shock. A lot of people were saying, what the heck is going on here? It didn't make a lot of sense. And we're talking about, I call Prince a musician's musician. This was a person, as you talk about spirituality, this was a person, as Clint and I were talking earlier about, he was connected to source. He could bring things through and interpret them in such a way that could get to the masses. So let's get into Prince a little bit. And how did you react when you heard that he had left the planet?
Well, it was a bolt out of the blue for me, completely unexpected, as it probably was for most people, because he's kind of been out of the public eye for quite some time. I know he's still been doing concerts and he's still been making music, but he's not been high profile. He's not been in the public consciousness for quite some time. So
yes, he was literally just here in February doing his one man and piano tour.
Right. Yeah, I'm aware that he's been, active still. But I'm just saying that he's not been a major name in people's minds in the last few years. But Prince was...
Mark, can I just stop you for a second?
Yep.
Just a quick question. Do you think that there's no market for Prince anymore?
I think there's been a generational shift since his heyday of the 80s. Yes. And I think what people expect from the music scene now is very different to the sort of stuff that Prince used to put out. I mean, I'm just... It may be me getting old and I have to consider whether it is that, but I just look at music that is popular now, music that's in the charts, and none of it speaks to me in any meaningful way, and I really do mean none of it.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad it's
clapping you for that because we feel the exact same way.
I'm glad it's not just me. I mean, I look at it sometimes and I think, Jesus, am I really that old and that out of touch, or is it just that the music is shit? Excuse my
the latter.
Excuse my cursing. Is it just that the music is rubbish? And there's really nothing about it that I appreciate anymore. I don't like the production styles. Everything is electronic and digital and grating. You don't get any soulful samples anymore in hip-hop like you used to. The lyrics just seem to me to be completely vacuous and ambiguous, and they don't say anything meaningful to you. You don't hear artists expressing themselves the way great artists like John Lennon and Marvin Gaye and Bob Marley and people like that used to. There's no message in the music anymore. It all sounds the goddamn same. It does to me anyway. It's templates and blueprints once again. And, you hear about songs that have been written for artists like Rihanna, and then at the last minute they decide, we won't give this to Rihanna, we'll give it to Britney Spears instead. Mm-hmm. So all these artists are being used for are just, outlets for these songs that are being churned out on a conveyor belt by the music industry machine. So I'm just not feeling any of it. So your question about whether Prince would be relevant to this generation, probably not. I think it would take somebody of a certain age who remembers different styles of music and remembers days when the industry flourished in a much more natural way to appreciate what somebody like Prince has put out there. So, when it comes to Prince, it was a total shock. And I'm sure you've noticed, guys, 2016, quite a lot of famous people have been dying this year. And they're even talking about this in the mainstream. What is it about 2016? Right from the very start of the year, so many celebrities have been biting the dust. I think Natalie Cole was one of the early ones this year, if I'm not mistaken. And then pretty much from that point on, it's been a different celebrity pretty much every day or every other day. So David Bowie was 11th of January, and there's just been so many since then, it's ridiculous. So Prince is the latest in a long line. And it really feels like we're losing so much talent, particularly to have lost David Bowie and Prince within just a few weeks of each other.
It's inconceivable, really, isn't it, Mark? If somebody had said that to you this time last year, you just would have gone, no, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Well, it does.
And so there are many different possibilities here and interpretations you can put on it. I mean, first of all, you can go with the mainstream version of events, the official version, which is all these famous people just happen to have died, and it's very sad and it's very tragic, but it's just the way it goes. They've died of cancer, they've died of heart attacks or whatever it is, the flu. Prince died of the flu, yeah, right. Because that happens to a lot of guys at 57, doesn't it, that are vegan and that work out. They just happen to die of the flu in a lift.
I'm pretty sure Prince isn't short of money either, so he could afford the best food, the best health care.
Well, this is the other thing. You hear of guys like David Bowie dying of cancer. Now, if David Bowie really was unfortunate enough to contract cancer, and I can't say whether he definitely had it or not, but supposing he did, do you not think David Bowie is the kind of wildly bohemian, rebellious, creative kind of individual that would not go for chemotherapy and radiotherapy and big pharma drugs, but would instead investigate alternative cures for cancer? So he'd be doing things like looking into Rick Simpson cannabis oil and looking into all these other natural compounds that we hear cure cancer. And yet there was no talk of that in the mainstream. You can understand why they would cover it up. But, you know, it's all very suspicious, and all these mainstream accounts of what happened never really seem to add up. So you can go with the mainstream version of all this. And then there's the more conspiratorial take on it, which is that a lot of these artists are actually being taken out for whatever reason, whether it's ritual sacrifice, whether it's because they're becoming a thorn in the side of the establishment, or they're not playing ball with some agenda or other, and so they've got to go. And, you know, you kind of have to wonder, if you're open-minded and if you're prepared to go wherever research takes you and consider all the options, you have to wonder whether there's an element of this going on. And then the third kind of interpretation that people can put on it is that the likes of David Bowie and Prince haven't actually passed away the way we're told they did, but in some way they've kind of faked their deaths. And it's
I said that to Matt last week.
Right.
About Prince. I said, you know, we've fed the mainstream narrative that the man's died, but
right.
who's to say he hasn't?
Yeah.
We were talking about this earlier, Mark, and we were talking about the fact that everything happened quite quickly around Prince, as in they found the body, an autopsy was done. 1 hour after the autopsy was done, the body was released. About 5 hours after that, a nice little ceremony, and the body's cremated.
Right.
And no one got to see any little part, any piece of that. Therefore, what the heck is going on with that? A lot of people thought that was quite quick, the way that was handled. So
yeah, there's a lot of things. Sorry.
I'm up in the air about that. Obviously this is what's going on. This is what was stated. It is what it is. Yep. What does your gut tell you about what's going on with Prince?
Well, whenever you get a prominent artist supposedly dying in circumstances like this, there are always so many anomalies and discrepancies and things that don't add up. And so researchers that try and get to the bottom of what really happened just get tied up in knots and get sent down one rabbit hole after another. And if you're not careful, you can just get absolutely mad with frustration and you can start to lose your mind. So you really do have to stay grounded and take a deep breath with all of this stuff and keep it all in context. My gut feeling with Prince, I've got to say, is that he was done away with. I think he probably has died. I'm not saying that artists don't fake their deaths necessarily. We've heard that with so many artists over the years. There were strong rumours that Elvis in some way faked his death and went off to live out his final years out of the public spotlight. There have been rumours in the hip-hop world that Tupac in some way faked his death. We get it with Jim Morrison. We've had it with Michael Jackson. There are even some researchers that claim that John Lennon faked his death. I mean, who can possibly say with any certainty whether any of these things happened or didn't? I certainly can't. You know, all of them remain a possibility. But my instinct when it comes to Prince is that he's no longer with us and that he was got rid of in some kind of ritualistic fashion, because there's so much symbolism and so much evidence to suggest that this was the case that, as far as I'm concerned, it can't be overlooked. And what you were saying about things happening very quickly, I don't know if you saw, but I think it was certainly no more than 2 days after we got the news of Prince having died, Niagara Falls in the US was illuminated in purple. Did you see that?
I didn't see Niagara Falls. I saw the Empire State Building and a few other things, but not Niagara Falls.
How
No.
did they do that so quickly?
Right, exactly. Well, they illuminated the Niagara Falls in purple and drenched it in this purple light. And they were saying it's purple rain, you know, with the water all cascading over the waterfall there. All the headlines were saying purple rain. And it was supposed to be in tribute to Prince. And they drenched all these other monuments and landmarks in purple as well. And it struck me that they'd managed to organise all of that very quickly. When you think about the logistics that would be involved in getting the Niagara Falls lit up like that, you know, all the equipment and all the stuff that would have to be brought in, and then you have to get the cameras there to make sure it gets out to the media and stuff, and there'd have to be all these teams on the ground organising everything. That was put together very quickly, within a day and a half or 2 days of the news. So that's just one of so many anomalies. It does tend to suggest foreknowledge of what was going to happen. Or I suppose it's possible that the whole thing, you know, was some kind of hoax and that it was planned for a long time before. I can't really say with any certainty. All I can do is highlight some of the very strange stuff that went on. And then, of course, we have the fact that Prince's reported death coincided with the 90th birthday celebrations, what the hell is there to celebrate, of the Queen of England, or the Queen of Germany, if you want to be precise about it.
Yeah, very good.
But yeah, the 90th birthday of the Queen of England, a lot of conspiracy researchers are suggesting that Prince's death, or his reported death, in some way constitutes some kind of sacrificial gift to the Queen. Because, you know, you have Prince and then the Queen, and then a lot of newspapers have been using the headline Purple Rain, as in R-E-I-G-N, you know, and doing a bit of wordplay there. So there's all kinds of symbolic clues if you want to go down that route. And there's also the fact that the 19th of April represents the start of a long period associated in the ancient world with sacrifice by fire, leading up to the 1st of May, which is Beltane ritual, which is a time that's very important in the dark occult calendar to many of these dark occult practitioners. And there have been so many prominent events which have happened on or around the 19th and 20th of April over the years. There was the Waco siege in Texas. There was the Oklahoma City bombing. There was the Boston Marathon event. There was a whole load of others that have all occurred around these times, and they've all been associated with death. So here we have the reported death of Prince coinciding with that same time frame and tied in to the 90th birthday of the Queen. And the Queen, of course, is very deeply tied into this satanic dark occult network that we have, basically controlling human affairs around the globe. She's very key to it. People like to think she's got no power and that it's all ceremonial and that she's just good for tourism and all that nonsense. But, you know, she's very deeply involved in all this, trust me.
Clint, if I can ask you something real quick, as Mark was mentioning this. When was the Port Arthur massacre?
Ooh. Go back to Mark. Let me just...
I'm trying to figure that out because I'm thinking it was coming up around this time, actually. It would be an anniversary, wouldn't it?
I've got to feed the mouse that turns the wheel in my head.
I got you. Got to feed the mouse that turns the wheel in your head. Okay, Mark. Okay, that's the one thing. Now, about the whys for all of this. Now, Prince was wealthy. He had his own empire insofar as music was concerned. He had pissed a few people off.
Yeah.
Insofar as they talk about the fact that, you know, he went around, he did an end around and basically got his masters back and got everything that he needed to get done.
That's right.
And I can guarantee you people will definitely hold grudges over that. Little Richard went through a similar situation. James Brown went through a similar situation. Ray Charles didn't have to because he made sure he kept all of his masters. So this has gone on before, but it seems to me that some people in the music industry, some artists in the music industry, tend to fall into this trap, so to speak. And one of the ones I wanted to bring up that's very important to me was Whitney Houston. So we're going to have to talk about Whitney Houston coming up in a little bit. But Clint is looking at me with wide eyes open, so let's see what he has to say. Go ahead.
I think it's late April. It was 1996, because I remember what I was doing that day. I was writing an essay.
So once again, it falls into Mark's time frame for around the April going into May.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's another one that could be another sacrifice. What was that, 37 people or something like that?
35 people.
Yeah, massacred. Yeah. So that would fall into it as well. Now, in your book, Mark, you do talk about Whitney Houston. And you talk about Clive. I'm not going to say his last name. And everything that went on. I'll give you a quick background on Whitney Houston as far as I'm concerned. My cousins were in a group called LTD, Love, Togetherness, and Devotion, back in the 1970s, going into the 1980s. My cousin's Jeffrey Osborne, a singer, R&B singer, and he wrote one of the songs on
the
Whitney
Wings of
Houston's
Love and all that good stuff.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly who he is. And he wrote one of Whitney Houston's songs for her debut album. Now, she actually went on tour with him, and she was the opening act for him when her first album came out. So I got to meet her and her parents, and she was just a stunningly beautiful, lovely young woman with a voice that just struck me as just incredible. And I literally got to watch her self-destruct over the decades, and it's just an interesting story. So maybe we can get into a little bit what you know about what she went through with that.
That's because Kevin Costner left.
Oh, let's not go there. That doesn't matter whatsoever.
I did a podcast interview yesterday with Freeman, the researcher from America, and also a guy called Matt Sergiu, who is a UK researcher. And we were discussing all these elements of Prince. And Matt raised the point that when you think back to the very biggest US artists of the 1980s, you could certainly make a case for that being Michael Jackson, Whitney Houston, Prince, and Madonna. And so out of those four, we've lost three, and we're left with Madonna, who is often referred to as the grand priestess of the industry, because she is, in the same way as Jay-Z is quite senior in the pecking order now, as we mentioned the other time. Madonna would appear to be very far up the ladder when it comes to, being a part of the agenda and being used for it. She's obviously famously into Jewish Kabbalistic ritual magic.
Yes.
And she's performed at Grammys award shows and the Super Bowl show and stuff, and her shows have been absolutely drenched in occult symbolism. It's like an A to Z of symbology. So she's very much doing the bidding of her industry masters, and she's obviously a chosen one, and she's obviously a favourite for unrolling certain parts of their dark occult agenda. So we still have Madonna, because presumably she's still being put to use and they still have plans for her. But when it comes to Michael Jackson, Prince and Whitney Houston, they've all gone, and there are very suspicious elements surrounding the reported deaths of all of them. There's a lot of parallels actually between Michael Jackson and Prince when you get down to it. Michael Jackson, Prince and Madonna were all born in 1958. And then you have the fact that Prince and Michael Jackson both grew up in households with abusive fathers. I think everyone knows the story of Joe Jackson, Michael's dad, and how he pushed all his kids into the showbiz limelight. But Prince's father apparently was very abusive towards him as well. And this is actually documented in the movie Purple Rain, which is an autobiographical movie from Prince. Very good film, actually, often overlooked, but a great movie, always been one of my favourites. And it kind of tells the story of how Prince came up in the game and his home life. And then you have the fact that both Michael Jackson and Prince got into legal wrangles with their record labels related to publishing and masters and stuff like that. And both of them were highly critical in public about their record labels. Michael Jackson famously referred to the Sony Corporation as evil, and to the Sony CEO Tommy Mottola as the devil. And then you had Prince, who came out very vocally against Warner Brothers and complained about the deal that he was getting through them and the way he was being exploited. And for a time, he appeared with the word slave etched across his face, indicating that he considered himself to be a slave of the industry. So that would have pissed off his overlords, certainly. But, you got parallels there between Prince and Michael Jackson. And so it's interesting that Prince, Michael Jackson and Whitney Houston, who were highly influential and whose music uplifted and inspired a lot of people, an entire generation during the 1980s, have all been got rid of. And a lot of researchers have highlighted what are quite possibly sacrificial elements and ritual elements to the ways in which they were done away with. So getting round to Whitney Houston, she was discovered dead in a bathtub in the Beverly Hilton Hotel in Los Angeles, February 2012, and it was at the time of the Grammy Awards of that particular year. And what happened was, when the news of her death broke and hit the mainstream, there was a Grammys party going on in that hotel on the ground floor, hosted by Clive Davis. Clive Davis is a long-time record industry executive. He's been in the industry for decades, and he's credited with having discovered Whitney Houston and put her on the map. So, he's very much her mentor, and she was his protege. And so this party was being hosted by him. And it had become common knowledge by the time the party had started that Whitney Houston was lying dead in a bathtub a few floors above. And for some reason, her body wasn't removed straight away. It remained in that bathtub until sometime around midnight, when it was finally taken away. So you had this party going on downstairs when her body was up above. And a lot of people that were at that party, and one of them was Shaka Khan, the artist, who later came out in a few interviews, said that they considered it very strange and actually in poor taste that this party continued. And there seemed to be almost a celebratory air to it, as if the party was celebrating, the ritual passing of this goddess diva figure, Whitney Houston. So that alone is very strange. Then you have the fact that Bobbi Kristina, Whitney's daughter, with Bobby Brown, was discovered unconscious in the same bathtub, in the same hotel suite, 24 hours before Whitney's body was discovered. So what the hell is all that about? And, bathtubs is a recurring theme, because in January 2015, Bobbi Kristina was discovered again, unconscious, unresponsive, in a bathtub, this time at her home in Georgia. And she's said to have been discovered by her husband, even though it emerged later on that he was never actually her husband. What's the guy's name? Nick something, I forget his other name. But, he was presented as her husband, but he turned out not to be. And there was a family friend that came forward at the time that this news broke, saying that she didn't believe that Bobbi Kristina would ordinarily have been in a bath. She wouldn't have taken a bath, because she said ever since what happened to her mother, she was obviously very traumatized by the fact that her mother was found dead in a bathtub. She wouldn't go anywhere near them. She was terrified of bathtubs. She always took showers. And yet, she's discovered in a bathtub. And so she was then taken to hospital in a coma, and she remained in a coma for several months until July of 2015, when she finally passed. So that's led a number of other conspiracy researchers to ask whether Bobbi Kristina's death was some kind of ritual sacrifice in line with what happened to her mother. So many things that just don't add up. We weren't given a proper cause of death for Whitney Houston. The mainstream media just tends to be relying on the public's perception of her as having been this wild character that just went off the rails. She hooked up with Bobby Brown and he got her into drugs, and she just went in this downward spiral and her life became a mess. That's the perception of her that's been pushed by the mainstream for the past few years. But there was no official cause of death given. It was just implied that she'd taken an overdose. And you get this with a lot of artist deaths. When it comes to Jim Morrison, for instance, there was no coroner's report, there was no autopsy. It was hinted at that he'd taken some kind of overdose, but there was no official cause of death given. And, it's very hazy with Michael Jackson as well. And then when you get to Prince, initial reports were suggesting that he died of the flu. How the hell do you die of the flu at 57, you know? And then they were suggesting, then it kind of changed, and there were hints that he was on drugs, he was taking some kind of narcotics, and then that kind of changed into, oh, he was on some pharmaceutical medication, and it may have been that killed him. So everything is ambiguous, everything is hazy, and we're just left to kind of make the best of it. And most members of the general public, I think, just can't be bothered to do the research. They get a bit confused and they just write it off, and they think, oh, well, you know, it's rock and roll, it's music, artists die, they live these lifestyles, and it happens, let's move on. But, you know, for researchers that like to get to the bottom of this stuff, it really can confound you and drive you crazy.
Okay, sorry to interrupt you there, Mark. I said the name Keith Richards, and I meant that in regards to if anybody was going to do themselves in with too much narcotics, you would have expected it with him by now.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
That's okay. I really interrupted you when you were speaking before, and I mentioned the name Keith Richards when we were talking about narcotics. And I said most artists, the benchmark of an excessive rock and roll lifestyle would have been Keith Richards, although I'd imagine these days he'd be more of a teetotaler than anything else.
Yeah, I think they get away with a lot of these artists' deaths just purely because people chalk it up as these wild rock and roll lifestyles. We all know that rock stars like their drugs. We all know that they live the fast life. We all know that they like a drink. And a lot of people just seem content to put all these deaths down to that. But one thing that I noticed when I was researching my book and I was going into the deaths of all these prominent artists, whether it's Jim Morrison or Jimi Hendrix or Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones or Robert Johnson going way back, or Bob Marley, John Lennon, Michael Hutchence, anyone you want to mention, is so many of these deaths are attributed to either an overdose, that's often all we get, just the word overdose, it's not specified any further, or suicides. And this happens a lot with the associates of many rock stars. So, you know, their spouses, their girlfriends, family members, people close to them, their managers. We're just told it's suicides. And so two of the most recurring themes throughout the stories that I cover in my book are suicides and overdoses. And again, most people just seem content to leave it at that without looking further into it.
Let me throw out an idea for you, Mark, because I thought about this quite a bit. You've done a lot of research into this area, and let's take somebody like a Kurt Cobain or something like that. And he's portrayed as a troubled, disheveled, lost kind of a soul. But would you say that could have been part of his musical persona to sell records?
Well, I think it probably was, because the public does seem to lap up a kind of rebellious icon, a larger-than-life rock star that represents, you know, an edgy kind of lifestyle and angst and, opposition to the establishment and all of that. There have been many of these types of figures through the decades. You know, Jim Morrison was certainly iconic in that way, and Kurt Cobain could be said to be, you know, another representation of that kind of iconic figure. So,
this is the thing with those kind of things. Excuse me, Mark. This is the thing with figures like that. We look at the industry and we look at the fact that the music industry is very well controlled. You find somebody and they portray a certain style of music and they do very well with it, and the industry sees them doing well. All of a sudden, they come up and they say, you know, I'm really tired of this. But the industry says, no, you have to continue. And they say they're tired of this. All of a sudden, you start seeing little ways for them to rebel. And if they take it too far, that's where I think you're overdosing and things like that come in, because they say, no, if you don't do it our way, then you're going to leave.
Or that just sounds really record.
They tried that with a lot of artists, but a lot of times, and I'll run this by you as well, Marcus. Clint and I were talking about this last week. This is the fact. Music, everything in this universe is vibratory.
Sure.
We're talking about artists that can come through and literally get to the point where you can control so many different things. You can control people. You can really inspire people. They do not want that to be that elitists have to control something along those lines. So being that that's the case, if you decide you have to leave the industry and basically stop doing what you're doing, they're not going to allow that to happen. So we have to be very careful with that.
Well,
this is what's going on with a lot of these artists, I think.
I don't think you ever can truly leave the industry, not if you're one of their key players. I think you're in it for life. I mean, people are probably familiar with the famous interview that Bob Dylan did with Ed Bradley on 60 Minutes, where Bradley asks him what the secret is to his longevity. And he says, how have you managed to stay in the industry for so long? And Dylan, looking a bit kind of regretful and wistful, says, I made a deal a long time ago. And then, the host says, who did you make the deal with? And a bit later on, he says, with the chief commander. And he kind of laughs. And then Ed Bradley says, the chief commander of this world. And then Dylan says, of this world and of the world we can't see. And he says, I'm holding up my end of the deal. So that ties into what a lot of industry insiders, and I've had so many musicians come forward, and producers and, singers and people that have been involved in the industry, record industry executives, have come forward since I put my book out and since I've started doing public talks. My inbox is full every day with people reaching out to me to say, I've heard what you've had to say about what goes on in the industry, and I can tell you, you're absolutely correct because I've seen it with my own eyes. I've experienced this stuff, back in the 70s or the 80s or whatever, when I worked at this record label or I was a part of this group or I encountered this individual. What happens is you sign a contract with these corporations, and that contract basically binds you for life. Particularly when you become an A-list artist, when you become one of their key assets. I'm not saying that every single act that signs with a record corporation is bound for life, but if you become a John Lennon or a Bob Marley or a Michael Jackson or a Whitney Houston or, a U2 or even Muse, the group Muse, or, any of these other acts, you pretty much are bound by the industry and by that contract that you've signed. And you're doing what they say now, and there's no way out. And so they might allow you to go your own route for the first few years. And this is something that we do see play out. And just to use a couple of examples that I mentioned there, U2, I mean, we all know Bono's a piece of shit. And Bono is doing the bidding of his elitist masters now, and he's down with the eugenics agenda, and he's best mates with Bill Gates and stuff. And, we know Bono's true nature. But when U2 first came out, they were allowed a few years to express themselves in a very convincing and very impactful way as a group that had a message in their music. They came out with stuff like New Year's Day and Sunday Bloody Sunday, and they were making statements. And they were allowed to do that for the first few years. They seemed to be this politically conscious band that was making music that really spoke to people. And it wasn't until quite a number of years down the line that Bono's true colours started to emerge, and he was put to use with his extracurricular activities. They sent him down to Africa as part of the United Nations, Agenda 21 and all that, and it became clear that Bono was working for, these elite controllers. But U2 did a very convincing job of making people think they were this genuine music act. And then we had the same thing with Muse more recently, which is why I mentioned them. They brought out tracks like Uprising, and the lyrics to that are absolutely incredible in the context of what we know to be going on in the world and who really controls things and what the agenda is for the total spiritual, mental and physical enslavement of humanity. Muse were addressing that in Uprising, and they were saying, the human population is waking up and we're not going to take it anymore. We're going to rise up and take our power back. And then you had Ralph Bellamy, the frontman of Muse, making comments in public interviews about 9/11 being an inside job. And then what do you find? A couple of years down the line, Ralph Bellamy retracts his comments, and he comes out and says, I was mistaken. I now understand that 9/11 happened the way we were told it did, and, I was wrong. And no more tracks from Muse talking about we're going to rise up and take our power back. So it's either that these artists are allowed to go their own way for a short while, and if they're seen to be becoming a bit of a pain in the arse and a thorn in the side of the establishment, and they're saying things they would prefer that they didn't, then they're quickly brought into line. and co-opted with the agenda and told, right, you're now going to start making songs like this, and you no longer talk about this sort of stuff in interviews, and this is what we're going to have you doing now because we own you and we control your ass. Or it's that they sort of come out with this stuff, and it's all part of the long-term plan, which is it was always on the cards that these groups would eventually be pushing the agenda of the elites, but they put the public off their guard for the first few years by making these groups seem as if they're on our side and they're expressing what's on our minds, and, you know, they're genuine and authentic. People even attribute that to the Beatles. When you look at the Beatles' music, when that group first came out, for the first few years, for the first half of their career, really, they were making just quite innocent, pleasant love songs, really. Most of their songs were, you know, these nice, simple rhythm and blues-based arrangements, and they were saying things like, she loves you, and please, please me, and from me to you, and I want to hold your hand. And it was all pleasant, innocent music. Then, round about 1966, as the second half of their career kicked off, everything changed. That's when we got into the psychedelic era, and there were all these social changes going on in the UK and the US. The Vietnam War had started. There were all these artists coming out of Laurel Canyon, the folk rock scene, and all the connections there to military intelligence that we can get into. You had the Manson murders happening, and you had all this LSD had been unleashed on the American youth. All these massive social changes, the arrival of the contraceptive pill and the sexual emancipation that brought about. And in the midst of all of this, the Beatles' music changed big time. It became experimental, it became psychedelic, it had all these big orchestral arrangements, it became very tripped out. And you've got to wonder, is that the natural evolution of a group just exploring themselves creatively and just happening to want to go down that route? Or were the Beatles always intended to be used for mind control and social manipulation and the shaping of public perceptions and attitudes? And what they did was, for the first few years, they put the public off their guard, made everyone fall in love with the Beatles because they're these four lovable guys from Liverpool making these nice songs. And then at the chosen time, which in this case would be 1966, everything gets switched up. And, you know, they just rely on people being swept along with it and just going with the flow.
Mark, this is going to have to go for another show. So what I'm going to have to say to you is thank you, because now we have to wind it up because we're just run out of time. So okay. Mark's book is called Musical Truth. We will put up on our Facebook page all of your blogspot.com information, all of the information on your talks. So we here at Beyond 3D would like to thank Mr. Mark Devlin for talking with us, and we will definitely get in contact with you again, Mark, because the information is just too good to pass up. So thank you for your time, and Clinton and I both appreciate that.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay, time flies. Thank you.
It does indeed.